Good morning. God bless you. I was looking around today and I see, we're just a little down from normal here, but we got some people who are out of town and some people who are at training sessions, some people who just aren't feeling well. So keep the body in your prayer and just know that every day you're here is a better day for this church. It's a better day for this body. You all are very important. Each one of you, very important to us. I was just thinking today as we're starting now week 8 of this series that we've been in, a 10-week series, which means we only have 2 more weeks after this, and then we're into our Christmas series. I mean, we're not as quick at Walmart at recognizing the season coming, but we're getting there. And in just a couple more weeks, we'll have our Thanksgiving potluck, and then the week after that, right after Thanksgiving, we're going to start our Advent season. I am super excited about this. Christmas is just a fun season as well, but in the church, it's so important, so valuable. So I encourage you to be part of that, to be at everyone you can. If you know people, bring them. Tell them it's a great time to come. It's just a celebration. It's just wonderful. It's excellent. But how many of you remember the smorgasbord? Yeah. That place where you would go, someplace, where you would go and there'd be food of all kinds laid out, some kind of a beautiful buffet, like, for example, remember Sizzler used to have one in town. Just a little bit of just a small one there, their salad bar, but it was extra than that. And then there used to be a place down in the casino mill there. We never went to the casino, but we went to it was called the Saw Blade or something like that. It was another buffet. Oh, so amazing. Some of you are old enough, you remember King's Table. Remember King's Table? Or if you lived in another place, maybe North Chuckwagon or some other buffet, you'd walk in and there'd be like a whole table of all kinds of salads, every kind of salad you want, the green lettuce salads and the cabbage salads and the pasta salads. And there's another table of different kinds of pasta dishes and rice dishes and all this and mashed potatoes and gravy. And then, there's this, oh man, my favorite table, the meat table, right? Meats of all kinds. And, if you still had room left, there was the dessert table or dessert tables beyond that. You could get all this. And, I don't know about you, but I would load my plate up. And I would pass something up and I'll say, you know what? I'm going to get that on my second round, right? And the problem was when I got done with my first round, I was so full that I only had room to go back for the things that I already had tried that I really liked. You know what I'm saying? It's just absolutely amazing. There is so much food and so much good there, and yet, you have to make choices. You can't have everything. That's the idea of the buffet, is there's going to be some things that one person likes and something somebody else likes, and there's lots of food there. You cannot walk away hungry unless you choose to, but you can't eat everything. You can't partake of everything. And that's a little bit like what chapter 5 is in Ephesians. When Paul's writing this, there are so many things in this chapter that if we were to really go through them all, it would take us several weeks just to get through this chapter, and they're all good. There's so much there. It's like 32 verses, and I really hope this week that you'll take time to actually walk through that and just see what Paul has for us there, see some of those things that he has for your life. But we're going to get through a bit of it today, just really some small pieces of it. But throughout this chapter, there are some very short, powerful statements that all by themselves stand alone and say something to our life. For example, and I'll give you a few of these here, but if you could just grab onto these simple, profound statements, any one of them could just change your life, just revolutionize everything about how you live. Here, verse 2, Paul says, live a life of love. Just simple. But if you really understood that, if you could really put that into your life, how different would things be? Or over at verse 8, live as children of light. What does that mean? How do we live as children of light? And there's so many dimensions to that. And on the one side, it's pretty simple, but there's this depth to it that if you had time and energy, you could explore it and try to figure out how would it change your life? How much peace could you have from that? How much freedom could you have from that? And then verse 10, find out what pleases the Lord. We're going to come back to that, but that's kind of a clarifying question, like, oh, should I do this or should I not do this? Find out what pleases the Lord. That's such a difficult thing in our lives to do that. And then there's this verse 17, understanding what the Lord's will is. How do I do that? And why does it matter? Why is it important to figure those kinds of things out? And then there's a few others as well. In fact, there's one that's so critical, we're going to come back to and spend an extended amount of time on it in our last, in 2 weeks from today, when we talk about this. It's such a critical thing, and I think it's just one of those overpowering messages of the entire book of Ephesians. But 32 verses, and we're going to get to just a few of them today. So here's the deal today. If I say something and it doesn't resonate with you, it doesn't click, it doesn't line up with your life, it doesn't, to borrow a word from the 90s, it doesn't jive with who you are, I give you permission to tune out from that, okay? As long as you find something in this message, something that you can latch onto, that you can go for, that you can implement in your life. I give you permission to tune out of any of those, as long as you tune into maybe one of these that I've just given you, or something else that's there, and really adapt it. Now, caution, don't do it halfway. You're not going to get much out of any of these scriptures if you only do them halfway, if you only kind of partially invest yourself. Like, for example, live a life of love. That's not a cheap statement. That's not something you can just do quickly. That's not something you can just, get a couple things and then check it off. It's not done. It's living a whole life. Everything, 24 hours a day, every place you go, every person you meet, all the time, everywhere. Living a life of love. Or find out what pleases the Lord. What does that mean? Well, you've got to do some serious investigation to what the Lord wants. And you've got to do some comparisons between maybe what he wants versus, say, what you want. Because that's where we often end up, is where we want. So if you're going to invest some time in this, if you're going to take one, go for it. Go all the way. Just take one. That's fine. But go for it 100%. And I guarantee you, if you can live a life according to any of these, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be simple. You might not even like it, but it'll change your life. 2 weeks ago, we turned a corner in this series. We went from the first 3 chapters into the last 3. If you remember the first 3 chapters, where Paul's exploring this deep theology, how we once were dark, how we once were dead, how we used to be separated from God, and yet God came in and he renewed us and he refreshed us and he gave us new life and he called us into his family. And that's what the first 3 chapters were about. It's all theological, all philosophical. It's all stuff that's happening that God did for us and what he did for us. And it's kind of the why of what the rest of the book is. And then the last 3 chapters we began last week talking about, okay, so here's what. If this is true, if God really did this, then now what does it mean for us in our lives? What does it do for us in our lives? How should we different? How can we be, live this way different? And it starts off, in fact, in chapter 4, verse 1. He says, live a life worthy of the calling you have received. Wow. All this stuff over here, this calling that God gave on us, this anointing, this bringing into the family. Because of that, live this life that's worthy of all that. He says, don't live, remember, like the Gentiles and the futility of their thinking. Don't live like you used to live. Don't live like you used to think. Live a different life altogether. And he does this comparison, like, here's the old way where you're thinking this way and you're living this way, but now you're a new creation. That was then, and this is now, and that's where we're at. So he's talking about, here's why you're doing this, because of what God did for you over here. And then last week you talked a lot about this, where he says, put off, remember, to banish. Don't just store it away for a later day, but banish it, get rid of it completely. Put off the old self, because it's deceived and corrupted. And he says, put on the new. And if you remember what he says, put on the new so that you can be like God. So that you can be like God. And that's where we're going to land on today. That's where we're going to kind of focus throughout this whole idea of being like God. And he's going to continue through those same thoughts as he goes on in his letter. So verse 1 of chapter 5 starts out like this. Be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children. Be like God. Be an example from what God has already given you. I mean, do what he did. Be like him. Be imitators of God. And he's going to come back to this whole idea that don't forget who God has created you to be. Don't forget who you are. This is about your identity. So be who God made you to be. He made you to be. He created you in his image, right? But we've walked away from that. We've decided we don't like the image of God as much. We want to be our own image. We want to create our own identity. And Paul says, no, that's the old way of thinking. That's the way you thought when you were Gentiles, when you were in the dark, when you were dead, before you came into the family. Now you know that God has brought you into his family. You're now a child of God. You're not living as a sinner. You're living as a child of God. Be who God has made you to be. And you're no longer strangers and aliens. You're now adopted as sons and daughters. He's your father, and he wants you to be like him. Now, when I hear that, I'm like, no way. I am nothing like God. And that is true. If you looked at my character, I'm embarrassed of who I have become in my life. And if we're honest with ourselves, many of us could say the same things. Oh, I know where I was, and I've improved, and I could justify myself by saying, well, I used to be that way, but I'm not as bad as that anymore. And that's true. But I look at who I am now, and I'm like, I'm still nothing like what God wants me to be. I am not capable of this. But Paul lays out for us exactly what it means to be like God, what it means to be imitators of God. See, what we're talking about here is living a life of love and light and wisdom. And that's what we're going to kind of go through today. Living a life of love, of light, and of wisdom. He says, be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children, and live a life of love. See, this is foundational to who we are. If we could just master that one thing, it would change the way we act, the way we talk, the way we think, the way we see people, the way we plan our lives, the way we prioritize things, the directions we go, all of our passions in life. All of them would be changed because we would be people like God who love others. Jesus, remember what he said? Someone said, what is the greatest commandment? Do you remember what he said? First greatest commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And, see, there's an and. It's not like there's just one, there's two, but they're really the same one. And love your neighbor as yourself. So you got to love God, you got to love your neighbor, you got to love yourself, but they're not separated, they're not isolated. They're together. They reflect off of each other. You can't love God without loving your neighbor. You can't love yourself without loving God or without loving your neighbor. They all kind of go together, and if you miss out on any one of those, you're not living this life of love. Jesus, when he comes, it says, in fact, it's not a soft, wimpy kind of a love. It says here, live a life of love just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and a sacrifice of God to God. See, that's what it means to live a life of love. It means sacrifice. It means giving up. What did Jesus give up? Well, let's see. He gave up his rights. He gave up his wants. He gave up his desires. He gave up whatever glory, whatever power he had. He gave up his life. He gave everything for us. And when he did that, it became this act of worship. And that's why Paul says he gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. This is how he worshiped God, was by giving up himself. So it's possible for us to come here to the church and we can have beautiful songs, and Sue or Tasha can lead us, and we can worship God in our hearts and our music, and it's beautiful. But God says, no, the worship I want from you, first and foremost, is I want the worship of your hearts. And I want the worship of how you treat people and how you treat the things that I give you and how you understand life. And so Jesus understood that true worship was sacrifice, giving up what he wanted and giving it to God instead. When we give up our own desires, when we give up the things that are meaningful to us, the things that entrap us in some ways, that's what worship is. That's what it means to love others and live a life of love just as Christ loved us. Because one of the ways we love the Heavenly Father is to love others. We share that love with him as we love others and as we give to them. That's what we're going to see in chapter 4 and 5. Living a life of love is marked by virtuous character and conduct. Now, virtuous, what's that? We don't even use that word in our vocabulary, virtuous. It doesn't mean hardly anything. It's a word we just don't use very often because it's kind of old-fashioned, let's be honest. It's a little outdated. So here's Paul. He is writing to the whole church. We've talked about that before. Us, all the way through the last 2,000 years, every church. But he's primarily writing to the church in Ephesus. And Ephesus is a port city. It's a big city. A lot of people would come in, very cosmopolitan city. People in, people out, is always flowing. It's very much like, some of the great harbor cities, even of America here. And so there's a lot of sailors that would come to town. And when sailors come to town after they've been at sea for a while, and they're now in town, one of the big things they look forward to is getting out and getting active. So there's all kinds of immorality that was happening, partly because of the sailors and things, but also because of the city. Lots of indulgences that were taking place in this. What happens in Ephesus stays in Ephesus. And all of this was embedded into the culture. So listen, Paul's goal, as he's talking, though, is never to condemn other people. It's never to condemn them in their sin. That's not what he writes about. when he says don't do this or stay away from that, his goal isn't to condemn. So as we're talking, I want you to understand, when we say things here, if they kind of jab at you, that's just the Holy Spirit saying, I need a change from you. Nobody is condemning you. God is not condemning you, nor mine, nor was Paul. He says, all this is how the world is. But I want to call the church to a different path. And so he begins this verse here. He says, this is how your world is. It's a very immoral, very apathetic, very evil in many ways and destructive. But, he says, but among you, church, there's a contrast. Here's how they are. Here's how the world is. Here's how the Gentiles were when they lived in darkness. But among you, who have been called from the darkness, who are now living in the light, who are the sons and daughters of God. But there's this difference. Society is this way, but among you, I want you to be different. Your friends are this way, but among you, I want you to be a little different. Your family is this way, but among you, you're called to a different lifestyle. He says, that's the way the world is, but among you, there must not even be a hint. Now, before I go on, let's talk about that. Not even be a hint. Tina has, in her later years here, become allergic to some things that she didn't used to be allergic to. She's allergic to walnuts, even though she used to love walnuts. She's allergic to honeydew melon and cantaloupe, even though she used to love those things. And there's a few other things as well. Now, if you make a salad and you get the honeydew in there, and it's there and she can't quite see it, or let's just say she sees it and she scoops out the honeydew, there is still remnants of that honeydew melon in that salad. Juices that you can't see, that you can't smell, that you can't discern, but she can. And she takes that, and this happened to her at a wedding we went to one time. She took some salad, didn't realize there was honeydew in it, and halfway home she began to choke up and could hardly breathe because someone didn't understand that even a hint of honeydew is dangerous. So Paul says, but among you, there can't even be a hint. There must not even be a hint. Whatever he's talking about must be completely out of our lives and our thought. It's what C.S. Lewis calls the most unpopular of all virtues. Paul says, but among you, there must not be even a hint of sexual immorality. Now remember, this is Ephesus. This is the important port city, multicultural, people all coming in. I think I have a picture of the city for this here. But it's this idea that this city is a lot of people coming in, a lot of people roaming around in this city here. And all this stuff happens on a regular basis. It's also famous for its theater. It's got a big theater in the city. And in this theater, as often happens in theater, Greek theaters especially, and Roman theaters especially, there is this immorality that's always taking place on the stage in front of everybody. It was a very well-known thing. But in Ephesus, the most well-known thing about Ephesus was not the fact it's a port city, not the fact that it had a theater, was this idea that it had a temple, the Temple of Artemis. Huge temple, massive temple, just a great big temple. And in this temple was Artemis, who was one of the goddesses of fertility. So in this temple, as part of this temple worship, there were temple prostitutes, thousands of temple prostitutes, women who are brought on either through servitude or slavery, or possibly in some cases just expected to be there. And when young men would come to the temple, they would, as an act of worship, would engage in sexual activity with these temple prostitutes. And that was considered worship. See, in our worship, we would say, whoa, let's not go there. That's against what we're worshiping. We leave that stuff to come to worship. But in their case, that's what worship was. You can imagine that they probably had a well-attended church for young men in those. The sailors all went to the Temple of Artemis when they were in town. So in Ephesus, which is the town he's writing to in this letter, it's both a cultural and a religious expectation and a encouragement, and even in some sense a bit of pressure on people to be involved in these kinds of things. So these words that Paul says, among you there must not be even a hint of sexual immorality, these words are countercultural, and they are extremely relevant for the churches that Paul is writing to. But as I've said, Paul is not writing just to the churches in Ephesus. He's writing to churches everywhere, including 2,000 years later to churches here in our Coos Bay, North Bend area, including right here to our church. And I'm sure you can see that these words are very relevant for us in our culture. That our culture has lost the idea that these things should be set aside from the life of virtue that God has called us to lead. By the way, it's not just something for young people. Some of these older people struggle with this as well. This is not an age-related thing. This is an everyone-related thing. It's a message, by the way, that you won't hear anywhere else. You're not going to hear this message out on the street. You're not going to hear it on Facebook or the TV that you watch or the movies you watch. You're not going to hear it in the music you listen to. Let me ask you a question. When's the last time you heard this kind of message coming from one of your own friends, or maybe someone in your family, or maybe sometimes even in the church, or in the schools? I mean, you don't get this kind of a message anywhere. It's a nonstop stream that we have of lies and misguided directions and information about how we are supposed to live sexually. And we see it everywhere that we go. It's just being bombarded. We're being bombarded by this. Our culture tells us that it's normal, that it's good, that it's better, and we're actually pressured to live that kind of a life. If we decide to wait until we're married for certain activities, or if we decide that we should be married at all, there are pressures against us in our society. People that say, it's my body, it's my life, it's my sexuality, it's my choice. Don't pressure me into your way. That's how things are. Don't be so old-fashioned. That's the message that we hear as we're trying to live according to God's word. And notice, in all of this, there's no voice anywhere but one small voice, the voice of God, that says, there must not even be a hint of all that. But Paul's not done. He says, but among you there must not be even a hint of sexual immorality or of any kind of impurity. Isn't that what Jesus is talking about on the Sermon on the Mount? When he says, it's not just about what you do. It's about how you think, right? That, in other words, to commit adultery, you don't have to actually just commit the act. You can have lustful thoughts, and you can commit adultery. To commit murder, you don't have to actually just kill somebody in real life or real death. You can actually think hateful thoughts against that kind of a person. Paul's not done, though. He goes on. He says, not even a hint of sexual immorality or of any kind of impurity or of greed. Greed? What's that got to do with it? Always wanting more, never having enough, never being satisfied. I mean, people like this, they're like this walking appetite, right? Got to have more. It's more excitement, more of this, more of whatever. Just always got to have more. Paul says, no, that's not what I want from you. You've got to have some kind of a sense of the idea that God will satisfy you instead of this idea of self-gratification. Paul says, not even a hint of sexual immorality or of impurity or of greed. And then he gives us the why. Because these are improper for God's holy people. They're improper for God's. They're not part of the old way of life. They're part of the new way. This is how you would have lived. But now we live this way. We have a different standard, a different set of goals, a different set of morals, a different outlook on life, a different view of people. We have all of these kinds of things. The world does this, yes. But we're not part of the world. We're in the world, but we're part of God's kingdom. And God says to all of us, I have a better way. Listen to me. Follow my voice. Do what I tell you. Go my directions. And then he goes on in verse 4 through 7. He gives some more stuff. We're not going to actually take time to cover that. That's why you need to read it this week. But he comes back in verse 8, and he says, for you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Notice he doesn't say you were once in darkness. He says, no, you were darkness, but now you are light. You were dead, but now you are alive. And he goes on and he says, so live as children of light. Don't live as children in the darkness. Live as children of light, because you are light. Being children of light says a little bit about who our Father is, doesn't it? Right? Our Father is light, and so we literally are the children of light. You remember Jesus said, let your light shine. It's interesting because what he really is kind of saying is let God's light shine through you, but he doesn't say it that way. He says let your light shine. Why is that? It's because we are light. He actually says you are the light of the world at one point. You are the light of the world. Let your light shine. And when we let our light shine because we're children of light, then the world around sees that in us. And they want it. They want that kind of a life. They want that kind of hope and peace. And so they glorify their Father in heaven, as Jesus says right there. In all of this, we have to let our lifestyle conform to our identity, and we have to let our actions confirm our identity. Paul says this is who we are, but if we're not living like this, then are we really here? Paul says, you're here now. This is who you are. Live like this. This is exactly who you are. And then he goes on in verse 10, and he says, and find out what pleases the Lord. Again, I love this. It's a clarifying question. Find out what pleases the Lord. If you're not sure what to do, ask yourself, who am I pleasing? Am I pleasing myself? Is that what my goal is here? Or am I pleasing God? Am I pleasing me or someone else? Does this draw me closer to Christ? Or does this make me fit more in line with my culture? And where Paul says, do not be shaped by your culture, but instead be changed by the renewing of your minds. Does this produce fruit of the Spirit in me, or does this produce the fruit of darkness? And then a few verses later, and I want to skip over again a few more verses because we just don't have time for everything, but there's so much good stuff here. But a few verses later, he gives us a warning. And the thing about this warning is it's really a warning for anyone, despite your age, despite your gender, despite the situation in your life, despite your belief. You cannot even believe that God exists, and the words that Paul shares here are still beneficial for you. They're still helpful for you. They're still something that you could take advantage of. Even if you don't even believe that God is existent at all, what Paul says is very powerful. He says this, and on the one hand, it's extremely simple again, but it's very profound. It has to do with how we make choices in life. Everybody makes choices in life. That's why everybody can take advantage of this. Paul says this. He says, be very careful. Now, just a little aside here. Whenever I read that, I don't know, something inside my little childish nature, but I always want to read it like Elmer Fudd. Be very careful, you know. You can't say it's ours right. Paul says, be very careful. Be mindful. Be thoughtful. Be thinking about this. Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise. A couple of verses later, he's going to say, therefore do not be foolish. Now, if you're a parent, it's probably something you said to your kids, right? You probably said something like that to your children, like, when you're picking friends, be careful. Pick friends that are going to bless you, that are going to help you, that are going to be good for you. And you're helping them pick those kids. When you pick music that's going to be edifying for you. It's not going to tear you down or tear others down. When you're talking about the kind of entertainment or the things you do or the places you go or the money you spend, be very careful. You know, you can't spend money and get it back easily all the time. So be careful when you spend your money. And hopefully you're modeling that or have modeled that for your children or maybe even your grandchildren. Ultimately, I think this is something we want for anyone we know. We want them to be careful. But the people we know, we want them to make good decisions. We want them to think without thinking unwisely or not thinking foolishly. And especially we want this for ourselves. Let me ask you a question. Raise your hands. If in your life at any time you have ever done something foolish. Okay, all right. And a couple of you had to look around and make sure others were raising their hands first. Yeah. If you didn't raise your hand there, you're lying. Because we have all done something foolish, right, in our lives. Some of those we laugh about later, some of it not. But the thing is, when we do something foolish, it affects us. Maybe it was a foolish relationship. You thought something would work out. You thought a direction in the relationship was good. It turned out not to be good. In fact, maybe it turned out very, very bad. Or maybe it was an activity. You thought, oh, this will be fun. This will be great. Let's go do this. And you get there and you find out it's just not a good thing, and you wish you had never made that. Or maybe it was an investment that someone said, hey, you should do this. And you did it, and it cost you a lot of money that you still haven't been able to get back. Or some other expense in your life. You thought, I'm going to buy one of these, or I'm going to get one of those, and you got it, and it's like, it wasn't worth it, or didn't work out, or broke, or something along that line. Or maybe for some of you, it was some form of improving your body. We could be talking about, tattoos or body piercings or something, but it could be just the amount of hairsprays you buy, or body lotions, or clothes you buy for yourself, something you bought, and you've spent an inordinate amount of money on these things, and yet every time you look in the mirror, you go, it's not working. And you're like, what's this about? What's this decision all about here? Sometimes after the fact, of these decisions we make that we would later term as foolish, we spend an awful lot of time and energy trying to undo them, trying to make things right. And when it's done, what we find is it often costs us a lot. It could be money, it could be embarrassment, could be some kind of a consequence or some kind of a pain we have, could be something we actually have scars from for the rest of our life. See, the issue here has to do with making the decision right versus making the right decision. See, when we're making the decision right, we decide something. We wanted that. We went that direction. Someone talked us into it. And then later on, we try to justify it or rationalize it. Try to explain it away. Well, you know, it wasn't really all that bad. We try to excuse it or defend it. We try to convince ourselves that maybe that's the only decision we had at that time. And there's all kinds of arguments. There's the FOMO argument, right? The fear of missing out. Hey, listen, this only comes along once in a lifetime. You got to do it. It's there. Or perhaps it's the YOLO. You only live once, You can't do it again, so you got to be out there trying it. Or what about this? Everybody else is doing it. It's one of those things we say, well, everybody's doing it. So, I mean, what could it hurt if I do that? Or sometimes we get to a point where we say, you know what? If I mess up on this, God will forgive me. He'll forgive me. He's a very forgiving God. He'll forgive me. Or, hey, I deserve this. I got to pamper myself a little bit. I deserve what I'm doing for myself. Sometimes later on we think, oh man, I deserved that, didn't I? Something along that line. And then we try to make our decision right instead of, in the first place, making the right decision. I wonder if there's any kind of a filter that we could apply to our life, to our decision making, that would help us to make those kinds of decisions in such a way that they would benefit us later, that they would bless us later, they would cause us less pain. And there's a lot of questions we could ask ourselves. For example, we could say, well, is it sin? It's a great question, right? Is it sin? Because we don't want to go in the way of sin. We say, is it sin? Yeah, probably. So that might keep us from a few things. But the problem is there's a lot of decisions in life that aren't technically sin. They're just stupid. You know what I'm saying? And sometimes we might make a stupid decision that really doesn't qualify as sin and later on have those kinds of regrets as well. Or we could say, well, what does the Bible say about that? Again, a great question. But let's be honest, the Bible doesn't individually address everything in our life. I mean, should I try meth? The Bible doesn't talk about meth except for Methuselah, who also had no teeth, by the way. But that's not a question that would help us in that. We've got to have another set of questions that sometimes just take us down a different kind of a path. I remember reading this a while back. W.C. Fields, if some of you older people remember W.C. Fields, great comedian, but not a very moral person at all. And as he was nearing his deathbed toward the end, one of his friends walked in and found him reading the Bible. He said, "What are you doing?" And W.C. Fields said, "I'm looking for loopholes." Is there a loophole in here? Is there some way to get through this? Sometimes things that we think should be in the Bible aren't there, at least not in word, but the principles are still there that we can get through. Here's another question. Will I get caught? Let me just say this. If that question, will I get caught, is part of your deciding factor whether to do something, just don't do it, okay? It's just not a good thing to do. It's not what you want to do. What about this? Is it legal? Well, that's a good question because we don't want you to be in jail, for sure. But sometimes we use this as a little bit of a definition of what we should be doing. Like, well, I'm 18 now, so I can do that. I'm 21 now, so it's legal for me to do that. That's not at all. Your goal cannot be, with all your questions in life, to keep yourself out of jail. That cannot be the driving force in all of your decisions. What would my friends think? Is that a good question? Yeah, that can be a good question, but it's not the best question. What would my parents think? Well, that could get us in trouble in a few places, but it could also be a good kind of a question. What does my spouse think? All of these can be good questions, but they're not the best question. See, Paul planted this church in Greece, in the southern area of Greece there, a little church called Corinth. Wasn't actually a little town, though. A very big town, cosmopolitan town, a lot of people coming in and going through it, living there. It's very much like a Las Vegas. Just the kind of morality that happened, the kind of idea on spending, things that happen, a very sensual, hedonistic, worldly kind of a place. And when he was there, he gave them the message of grace, that Jesus Christ loves you and that he wants to save you, and there's nothing you can do, but he does it through his own personal grace. But when he's writing back to them, he's referencing a phrase that they used to use as part of their definition and rationalization for the things that they do. And he says this to them in 1 Corinthians 10:23. He quotes what they say. Everything is permissible. See, that's what they said. Hey, everything's permissible. That was just an ongoing kind of a thought process. Everything's okay. Or like we could say this. When you're 21, it's legal. You know, it's okay to make those. There's a lot of things you can do, right? Everything is permissible, he says. Everything is permissible, you say, but not everything is beneficial. Everything is permissible, but not everything is constructive. So there may be things that you can do, but Paul says, just because you can do it does not mean that you need to do it. We need a different filter besides what is permissible, what is allowed. Just because I can eat Twinkies every day for Christmas does not mean that's a good decision. Just because I can own 40 cats does not mean that's a good decision. Just because I can wear a Speedo in Walmart does not mean I should wear a Speedo in Walmart. So you can understand that. So we get to this best question. What is this best question that we can always ask? Doesn't matter if we're following Christ or whether we're following the world's way. What is this very best question that we can ask? And the answer to that is, what is the wise thing? What is the wise thing to do? What is the thing that would be wisdom, not foolish to us? In 2004, Andy Stanley, who pastors a huge church back in Atlanta, Georgia, wrote a book called What is the Wise Thing, actually. 10 years later, he revised that book and renamed it. You can see the answer there. Ask it. Just ask it. Ask the question. Whenever you're facing any decision in life, the first question out of your mind that will steer every other question is simply this. What is the wise thing? Should I go this way? Should I go this way? Should I go this way? What is the wise thing? Now, that's going to lead you to making sure the Bible says it's good. Making sure your parents. There's going to be a number of little filters you're going to put on this. But the first filter that defines all those is, what is the wise thing? It's a great book. It's an easy read. I highly recommend it. But what is the wise thing for me? What's the wise thing for me in my current situation? Knowing where I used to be. Knowing where I'm going. With all of the parameters in my life. What is the wise thing for me right now? And when I think about the future, what is the wise thing? What is going to be good for me? What is going to be good for my family? What is going to be good for my church, for my Christian witness? What is the wise thing for me to do? Is it sin? If not, is that still a wise thing? You know, if it's sin, then what is the wise thing? Is it in the Bible? Maybe. But what is the wise thing? Is it legal? Possibly. But what is the wise thing? What do my parents say or my friends say? Yes, but what is the wise thing? In other words, when God's saying this, he's saying, listen, the first thing you come to in this is this idea that you got to choose to take the wise path, the wise direction. That's what Paul is saying up here in Ephesians 5:15 and 17 that we read just a bit ago. We'll read it in a minute. But back in the Old Testament, when Jeremiah is writing, he's speaking with God as well, and God gives this information to him. And he simply says it this way. And he's actually reflecting about decisions that his people Israel are making and are not making. So in Jeremiah 6:16, we read this. Stand at the crossroads and look. So you're standing. You got choices. This choice, this choice, this choice. These are the crossroads of your life, whatever those happen to be. Stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient paths. Why the ancient paths? Because they're tried, because they're true. Doesn't mean they're old-fashioned paths. They're just the tried and true ways, right? Loving people, being generous, helping people, caring about people, those kinds of things. Stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient paths. Ask where the good way is. What is the wise thing? And then he says, and walk in it. Take some time. Just stand there. You're not rushed. Don't let people rush you. Make the wise decision. What's the ancient path? What's the good path? What's the wise thing to do here? And then when you figure that out and walk in it, and here's what will happen. And you will find rest for your souls because you've chosen the right path. But he goes on and he says, in reflection of their decisions, he says, but you said, we will not walk in it. We don't want the wise path. We don't want the ancient path. We don't want the good path. We want to choose what we want to choose. It's our right. It's our business. It's what we have available to us. We don't want to choose what somebody else thinks is the best plan for us. We just want to make that choice for ourselves. And when we do that, then we have regrets, and we have remorse, and we have guilt, and we have shame, and we have consequences in our lives. And then What happens for us is we then try to justify and rationalize all these decisions that we've made. We try to explain them and excuse them, but always we want to go our own way. So that's why Paul comes along and he says this, and this is the whole verse that I started earlier. Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. There's evil all around us and trying to affect us. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. Not the Lord's will for the world, not the Lord's will for somebody in your family, what the Lord's will is for you, what the direction is for you, what he wants from you. Understand what God would have you do in your life, what he wants, what he thinks is best for you, which takes us right back to where we started today. Verse 1, be imitators of God. That's what God wants for us. Follow his plan as dearly loved children and live a life of love. You can never go wrong if you live a life of love. You can be taken advantage of, that's sure, but it's never a wrong choice to live a life of love. Just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God. What is the wise thing for me now, considering my past, knowing my future? What is the wise thing? So here's the challenge that I want to give you today. It's simply this, to surrender all your decisions to God. When you come up against a decision, don't make the decision without asking, what is the wise thing? What does God want from you? What is his will? I'm not talking about the little decisions like, should I have chocolate tonight or vanilla or chocolate chip cookie or chocolate chip, so I was going to have chocolate somewhere in it. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about real decisions. How should I engage with people? What choices should my life take? How do I uplift someone else? How do I love people? Always surrender those decisions to God. Let me close with a verse that I skipped over in the middle of all this. If you read it in context, it fits into what we're saying there. But I think if you read it here at the end, it actually gives a kind of a punctuation note on this whole thing. And most commentators, when they read this, because it's kind of phrased different than the other things Paul wrote, most commentators think this is part of an early hymn that Paul was quoting. And that maybe this hymn was used at monumental events in people's lives, particularly when they're coming from the old to the new. Maybe even at something like a baptism. And it seems to overlap kind of that thought of, here's where you were, here's where you are, make some good choices. And Paul uses it here in his letter to the Ephesians. It says, it's Ephesians 5:14, just the second half. Wake up, sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Kind of reminds me of, some of you that are older might remember, in the Portland area at least, there was a guy that sold a lot of televisions and VCRs back in the day when there was such thing as a VCR and washers and dryers and all that. His name was Tom Peterson. And these commercials he would put on late in the evening. And he would hit this little kind of thing in front of him. And he'd go, doo, 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 wake up. He's trying to get your attention. Wake up. And Paul says that here. Wake up, sleeper. Rise from the dead. You were here. Now it's time to get out of that and be over here. Don't live here. Rise from the dead. Live your life in the full. And Christ will shine. Remember, we're supposed to be children of the light. Christ will shine on you. In other words, don't snooze your way through life, follower of Christ. Don't live your life on the edge of the tomb, Christians. Wake up, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. You used to be dead, now you're alive. Wake up and live that way. And when you do, he'll shine his light, he'll shine his life on who you are. And it's life, it's a good and a blessed thing. Let's pray. Father, by your power, the power of your Spirit, from this day forward, help us just to live a life that is worthy of this calling you've given us. Help us, Lord, to imitate you, to live a life of love just as you loved us, and to demonstrate your love in us over and over every day. And help us to wake up from the life we used to live and the life we continue to live still as we still cling to remnants of our past, and to live a life that is full of light, full of love. And help us, Lord, in the decisions we make to always choose the path that is right, the ancient path, the good path, the wise path. Give us wisdom, Lord, to discern which paths are right for us and which ones are harmful. and help us be a model for all those around us, especially those who look to us for guidance and judgment. We give you praise, Father. May you receive all the glory and all the thanks, all the gratitude for your people. We ask it in your